John's Presbyterian in White Rock. This morning we're going to have a little look at the sacred music of the early North American settlers and the colonies that settled in New England in the 1600s, the early 1600s. And our story begins with the Mayflower. Now, although it is known that there was another colony prior to that on Roanoke Island, as the story goes, the entire colony mysteriously just disappeared. And of course, this is just a playground for all the conspiracy theorists as to what happened to these colonists. But after that came the Mayflower. Now, this story is tied in with the Puritans and the Separatists. So I'll give a little bit of touching on some church history. This program really is not about church history per se, but as I've mentioned before, a lot of the time the hymns and the songs are tied in with the different churches and the different factions and denominations' history. So I need to touch on some of them. It needs to be understood that the Puritans, back in the 1600s, were part of the Church of England. And if you remember from our last presentation where we spoke about the Reformation in Britain, that the Church of England essentially broke away from the Church of Rome based upon Henry VIII wanting to divorce his wife and the Pope not allowing it. So they went through various movements and various programs to set it up so that the Church of England had complete and utter power in Parliament. The king actually became the head of state as well as the head of the church. Of course, later on with Queen Elizabeth II, the Church of England, as we now know it, was fully established, and she was head of the church. So there is an amalgamation of church and state. Some people feel the two entities should be separate, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Other people are like, well, no, a figurehead like that is put there by God, so therefore she can rule the church as well as the state. Now, one of the problems with melding the two together based on history, and the perfect example is with the Puritans and the Separatists, is at the time, if you were not a member of the Church of England, you were an enemy of the state. So the two were together. And if you were an enemy of the state, you were against the Church of England. So you had to agree with both in order to get along in society. There was a lot of persecution that went on when people started speaking up against the church. So we were seeing a lot of court proceedings, people thrown in dungeons, people being executed, beheaded, you name it, even burnt at the stake. So this is the story of the Puritans and the Separatists. Now, the two are related. So people oftentimes think that they're one and the same or that they are totally apart and different entities. But they were actually sister movements, I suppose you could call them. The Puritans wanted to purge the Church of England of Catholicism and to get rid of all the last vestiges of Catholicism. And the Separatists realized very early on that this was just not going to happen. So they broke away from the Puritans and decided that as Separatists they were going to move outside of the Church of England and start their own movement. Of course, either way, both groups were persecuted. Number one, how dare you come in and try and change the established state church, who has a royal figurehead of state as also the ruler over the church. And the Separatists, of course, were persecuted, like, how dare you leave the Church of England? So no businesses were conducted, their businesses were shut down, military armies and soldiers were sent out to arrest people, thrown into dungeons and executed simply because they did not agree with the Church of England. What this eventually led to is that the separatist group eventually fled to the Netherlands, to the city of Leiden, where they were welcomed with open arms. Of course, we know that the Calvinist movement was happening in there, so the hold that the Church of Rome had over the Netherlands was tentative. I mean, Catholicism was still practiced in the Benelux countries, but with the Calvinist movement in there, the separatists, the ones that were breaking away from the Church of England, felt that they were very much at home there. One of the issues that they had was that they were concerned that their offspring, the next generations, would start losing their English heritage and become essentially Dutch, if you will. So what happened was that they all fled back to England, and that is where the Mayflower comes in, because that was it. England was finished with them. The Church of England wanted to obliterate the group entirely. So on the 16th of September, 1620, the Mayflower set sail for Plymouth in the New World. Now, of course, not all of the separatists could leave. Some of them were older or sick or for whatever other reason. But they did settle in England. It was a rough journey, of course, across the Atlantic on an old wooden sailing ship. Now, as far as the Puritans go, eventually they too left. They too fled for the New World because they were being persecuted horribly by the Church of England. And they also sought religious freedom and a place where they could establish themselves, because they realized that there was no way to change the Church of England internally. Certainly without the Queen's blessing, there was just absolutely no way this was going to happen. So they fled, and they settled in Massachusetts, and they're called the Plymouth Colony. So you had the separatists first, and then you have the Puritans that settled there. Now, as far as the society goes, now this is very interesting, that the very thing that they were fleeing from, eventually they started practicing themselves, unfortunately. The Puritans and the separatists in the New World, in New England, so they fled Old England because they were being persecuted and they weren't allowed to practice freely, as we have seen with the Methodists. Of course, there are other groups in Britain too that broke away, like the Baptists. We will deal with them a little later. So when it comes to the Puritans setting up their colonies and establishing in Massachusetts and Boston and so on, they became intolerant of outside, what they viewed as outside groups. Now, when they first landed, they were very, very peaceful. They got along very well with the native people. In fact, the first Thanksgiving, the table was shared with native people. And the Puritans and the separatists were very, very wise. They left at a perfect time so that they landed in North America in early spring, so that they could start working the soil and planting their fruits and vegetables and setting up corrals for the animals. So their first bounty was shared with the natives, and they realized that they needed to befriend the natives because the natives knew the land. They knew where all the resources were. But they agreed from the beginning that they would not abuse or use the natives, but that they would work with them and trade with them, which is very noble. Of course, as history will testify later on, this just did not happen. So the Puritan colonies were some of the most successful because of their timing, number one. They came with plenty of supplies. They came in the spring so they could set up farms and grow and plant their own food. And they were getting along with the natives. However, later on, as history will testify, when the Shakers and the Quakers, which is also a British group, ex-Church of England, we'll get to them too, settled in the New World in New England, they were being persecuted. And they were being persecuted mostly because they were very liberal. In the Puritans' eyes, that was just a no-no. I mean, they crossed so many boundaries and broke so many rules, and they themselves would set up shop, that quite literally the religious organization, the Puritan churches, if you will, was now starting to run the colonies. So you had the same thing happening as what was happening in England. And anybody who was not Puritan or of the Puritan separatist sect was being persecuted and could do no business and no commerce or anything, or possibly be executed as well. Now, as far as the hymnody goes, it is recorded that when the Puritans and the separatists left Great Britain, they did bring hymnals with them. They also had, of course, as you know, when they settled in Leiden in the Netherlands, they started to adopt the Calvinist Psalms, the Genevan Psalter, and translate those into English. So they brought with them that rich tradition of the Genevan Psalter, the Calvinist Psalms, as well as an old psalm book, an old English psalm book, and called the Stern and Hopkins Psalter. Now, unfortunately, I've looked online to try and find music from the Stern and Hopkins, and I couldn't find any. Apparently, it was not unusual for old hymnals to just have words, and very often the melodies and the tunes were memorized. We will see that later on when we get to the Amish and the Hutterites. It was not unheard of that there was no music in the hymnals. However, with the Genevan Psalter, it was different. There was definite music used. Now, this is an interesting fact. The very first hymnal ever printed in the States was called the Bay Psalm Book, and it was printed in 1640. So this was specifically a Puritan hymnal, very interesting. There are reprinted copies and reproductions online, but they're all copyright. So you have to go online and buy the books. You can't find anything over the internet, just references to them. Apparently, the Bay Psalm Book had 27 editions, the last of which was 1762. So it is interesting that it is actually still available. So now we're going to move on over, because I couldn't get the Bay Psalm Book. We know the Genevan Psalms. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. They used to sing all of those songs too. So now let's have a look at the Quakers and the Shakers. Now this is a very, very fascinating movement, because the Quakers were first and the Shakers were an offshoot from the Quakers. Now, the Quakers were called the Quakers, not so much because they did any funny movements and stuff, though apparently they did enter into certain sort of ecstasy states when they went into a kind of a hypnotic state. Now, this is funny, going in depth into studying the Quakers and the Shakers. There were so many things that I didn't realize. That the Quakers, of course, being an offshoot, they came out of the Church of England. They found the Church of England too oppressive, too controlling, and too inclusive. And this was a problem for some people, particularly when it came to the topic of having female involvement in churches other than Sunday school teachers and singing in the choir. If any females wanted to move up the ranks, and they could possibly become deacons, but ministers and priests, no. So the Quaker movement was definitely the most groundbreaking and possibly the first liberal group that really came out of a traditional church. And they saw everyone as equal, male, female, young, old, children, everyone was equal. Their services contained no music at all, so I really cannot share any early Quaker songs with you. Later on is a different story. but we're talking about the early movement. Their services consisted not of a congregation in a church as we currently know it, with pews and a front stage and a pulpit, and there's the organ and there's the choir, and now we're going to sing hymn number, blah, blah. What their services consisted of, they met in halls or homes, or they called them meeting homes or meeting places. They didn't call them churches. They would all sit in a big semicircle. So there was no one sitting behind anyone. There was no separation of male and female and kids. Everyone was together because they viewed it all as equal. There was a presider who would lead the session, I suppose you could call it, and everyone sat in silence. And this is called quietism, where they felt that making a lot of noise and, believe it or not, even standing at a lectern and reading scripture or inspirational something was a no-no. They would just simply come together, have a prayer, and then leave it open for what they felt was the Holy Spirit to come and communicate through them. So it sounds a little bit like Spiritism or Spiritist church. And whoever felt inspired to say something or indeed sing something, though it was rare, if he or she or they felt that God was talking to them and needed to share something. So that was pretty much how their services went. With the Shakers, that came out of that movement was very popular, particularly with what would be classed as the lower working class in England. Again, very open, very female-friendly. So you would have female leaders. In fact, one of the founders of the movement felt that she was an embodiment of the second coming of Christ, which is quite controversial amongst most standard Orthodox Christians. That is something that sets the Quakers and the Shakers apart, is that they feel that the second coming has already happened. And they call themselves the millennialists. They even had a hymn book called Millennial Praise, and it all talks about Christ already being here and taking on the form of living people within their ranks. So that pretty much put them at odds with the royalty and the Church of England right there. And so what happened there is that they also had contact with people in the Netherlands. So there's a little bit of Calvinist influence, particularly with the songs. And eventually they just simply all fled to New England as well, where they were again persecuted by the Puritans. And they were very peace-loving. They refused to take up arms. They refused to go join any military or police. They believed in deep friendship. The Shakers also believed in total celibacy, so they didn't marry. So that could be viewed as a little bit of an oppressive thing. You have to be a Shaker so you can't get married. However, the movements did dwindle down. I believe that there are only two Quakers left in the world, and there are still some Shakers. One of their most popular or most famous composers of hymns. Now this is interesting because the Shakers loved music. The Shakers loved dancing. They would do a special dance in a big hall where all the men were in lines one side and the women were another side. And their movements, I suppose, gave them the name of Shakers, apart from the fact that they would also enter into an ecstasy state and start trembling and shaking as they get filled with the Spirit. So one of their famous composers is Joseph Brackett, from 1797 to 1882. And what he is most popular for is his song, Simple Gift, or "'Tis the Gift to be Simple." Now, this tune has been used on several other occasions, one of which was Sidney Bertram Carter, who was a contemporary composer, who used the tune, changed it slightly. The melody was changed slightly to match the words, and he set it to Lord of the Dance, I Danced in the Morning. Now, of course, there's, amongst certain scholars, there's a little bit of a question about Sidney Bertram Carter. He is apparently one of the modern Quakers. There are actually several composers while he passed away. He's from Britain. He was from Britain. Now, you've got to realize too that the Shakers and the Quakers considered themselves all-inclusive, not just in terms of gender. Later on, they made some statements regarding sexuality, marriage, sex outside of marriage, and all that kind of stuff. They were way more tolerant than either the Church of Rome or the Church of England. And certainly the Calvinists would have been no, 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 no. And the Puritans definitely, this was unheard of. So the Shakers and the Quakers were kind of seen as kind of loosey-goosey, and they certainly felt that they were way more open to other religious influences. They were accepting of other ideas, other theologies. So it has been noted that Sidney Carter, in his study, had a little statue of the dancing Shiva. So this caused a fair bit of a stir, I'm sure, amongst certain Christians. And some churches were questioning the hymn Lord of the Dance, because Shiva is known as Lord of the Dance too. Despite the definite Christian words and the story, a synaptic story of Christ, in the song, some people feel that there's a little bit of a sort of embracing a pagan idea behind it. So I leave that up to everybody to decide for themselves. It's just interesting that I did find some commentaries of this over the internet where some people were writing about it. So what I will do right now is I will present to you "'Tis the Gift to Be Simple." I will only do one verse of that. Apparently there are 4 verses. And then I will present to you "I Danced in the Morning," or "Lord of the Dance." And over there I will do 2 verses of that. It also goes on. It talks about him being born, how he called the disciples, how he ministered and healed the sick, how he was persecuted, died on Good Friday, and then rose on Resurrection Sunday. So, good. Simple gift. "'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place that's right, 'twill be in the valley of love and light. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right." So as you can see there is an allusion to their dancing. They would do a lot of turning and spinning as well, which sort of makes one think of the dervishes, that mystic movement in Islam, where they do a lot of spinning and turning. Apparently there is a reason for that, is that it does help to put people in the hypnotic state. So of course the Shakers and the Quakers, being open to communication from the spirit, would have used the dancing definitely in the Shaker movement anyway to attain that state. Now of course the Quakers were quiet, quiet, quiet. So now I will do the Lord of the Dance, contemporary Quakers. I already spoke about Sidney Bertram Carter. I will just do 2 verses of this. I danced in the morning when the world was begun, and I danced in the moon and the stars and the sun. And I came down from heaven and I danced on the earth. At Bethlehem I had my birth. Dance then wherever you may be. I am the Lord of the dance, said he, and I'll lead you all wherever you may be, and I'll lead you all in the dance, said he. I danced for the scribe and the Pharisee, but they would not dance and they wouldn't follow me. I danced for the fishermen, for James and John. They came with me and the dance went on. Dance then wherever you may be. I am the Lord of the dance, said he, and I'll lead you all wherever you may be, and I'll lead you all in the dance, said he. So certainly the Shaker idea of moving and dancing and entering into an ecstasy state is present in there as well. Now we move on to the Anabaptists. This is a group of people I really had no knowledge about. Just very tentatively here and there I would hear about them being persecuted as well. They were persecuted throughout Europe. They started in the Germanic central countries of Europe, particularly southern Germany, into Switzerland and parts of Austria, specifically Tyrol, and of course the Netherlands as well, and possibly some influences in northern Germany and the Low German states. So, who are the Anabaptists? Well, this is a group of Protestants who definitely felt that the church at the time was in error in promoting infant baptism, particularly the sprinkling of water on the forehead or making a cross or whatever, or pouring water. They felt that in order for baptism to really be meaningful, the person has to have lived a life, should have known sin, and should be consciously aware of making a conscious decision to turn away from sin and turn towards Christ. And then the public proclamation through full immersion baptism is really the correct way to do it. Now, the reason why they're not just called Baptists, now there is another group called Baptists. These are the Anabaptists because they felt that since they came out of the old church, their baptism, their infant baptisms were essentially null and void. So they needed to be rebaptized, and that's why they're called Anabaptists, because they went through ceremonies of rebaptism to do it right the second time, I suppose. They were not very well loved by the Lutheran Church. They were persecuted. They were also persecuted by the Church of Rome in Europe. A lot of slaughter, a lot of unfair trials, and just the same thing, dungeons and executions left, right, and center, because state and church simply did not agree with them, questioning the church at the time. The Anabaptists were also pacifists. They believed in living a very simple life. Just live off the land and live off what you really need. They would shun a lot of excess wealth, excess entertainment, in fact, they oftentimes would trim down their lives, and it was kind of severe, but they definitely felt that a simple life with as little external worldly influence and temptations as possible was a lot better to attain living a holy life. This carries through today to many groups that are within the Anabaptist family. Now, we need to realize that this Anabaptist movement had different little sub-movements and little groups here and there that saw a few little differences from each other, but essentially they were all Anabaptists, and they pretty much identified themselves as Anabaptists, just a little bit different from each other. The main Anabaptist groups that we know of today very well, of course, are the Mennonites. Now, as you can see from the slide, Menno Simons was in Netherlands, and he was the first one to start the simplistic pacifist movement, and the idea of full immersion baptism came there too. The Mennonites, there seems to be an old Mennonite and a new contemporary Mennonite movement. And the two of them are slightly at odds. The old Mennonites feel that the newer Mennonites are too liberal and too everything. But really, all the other Anabaptists feel that the Mennonites in general are way too embracing of the world. Big fancy churches, instruments in their church, driving fancy expensive cars, not shunning any worldly thing. They felt that the Mennonites were simply too liberal there. Then we get to the Hutterites, or the Hutterian Brethren. And this is another movement that started in the Low Countries and the Netherlands. Again, they were persecuted. They were persecuted by the Calvinists. They were persecuted by the Lutherans. They were just odd. They were very separatist. Even today's Hutterites feel that they need to separate. By the way, they share this with the Amish, that they take the example of God saying to Israel, don't marry any of the pagan nations that are surrounding you. Don't indulge in anything from these nations. Have as little to do with them as possible. But set yourselves apart as holy and keep yourselves pure and clean. So certainly the Hutterites and the Amish were founded by Jacob Ammann. So we have two Jacobs there. So today, that's why when they were in Europe, they were already forming colonies, but they had to flee because of persecution. They found refuge in Pennsylvania. That's where we get the Pennsylvania Dutch, which is actually, I believe, a version of Low German. However, there's probably Dutch spoken there too, for all I know. And then the Hutterite group also started moving into Manitoba, into Canada. Very separatist. They have their own colonies. Each colony seems to share some similarities within the groups, but they also share a lot of differences as well. As far as the music and worship with the Anabaptists goes, initially it was a cappella singing, which is with no instruments. The Mennonites started to shift off. The old Mennonites still felt that that was the proper way to do it, but the newer Mennonites wanted worship with a program and, hymn singing and things like that. So the first hymns that came over from Europe were definitely of the German type. It's not as if though they decided, let's start our own group and boom, we've got our own hymnal. Of course, they were using the hymns of the established church at the time. So Lutheran and Calvinist hymns definitely were used, the Psalms. Now, the Hutterites and the Amish use what is called Ausbund. Now, Ausbund in German apparently means paragon, and it is an old, very, very old hymnal that came over from the Germanic countries from Europe. Again, it was a case of it had all the words, but there were no tunes printed. So they would memorize the tunes. Later on, however, newer editions do have the music. Just one line. This is another thing with the Amish and the Hutterites. No instruments. I wouldn't say they never sing in harmony. The Mennonites certainly do. But in the church services, when they sing out of Ausbund, no. There's no harmony singing. There's no pianos and organs or anything. So I had a look on YouTube, and I encourage you to do this, and type in Amish worship singing, Amish music. And one of the things that I noticed is how similar the old Amish music sounded to the recordings of the old Presbyterian movements up in the Shetland and Hebrides Islands, especially the Isle of Lewis, which I mentioned previously in another program. They sound very similar. It's called line singing or responsive singing. Of course, the Presbyterians have a precentor that starts the first line and then the congregation comes in. Well, it's the same with the Amish and the Hutterites. They have one person who's presiding over the service to start singing, and then the whole congregation starts joining in. It's very slow. It's very austere. It sounds kind of dark. It's mostly in a minor key, although some of the later Ausbund songs were faster moving and cheerful, more cheerful sounding in major keys. They were initially very, very stern and very austere. You're singing to God, you're not just singing to your buddy sitting next to you at the bar counter. So there was a certain sacredness and holiness that they felt towards that. Now, the Anabaptists are still around today, very strong, other than the Hutterites and Amish. There, of course, is the Mennonites. There's also something called Church of the Brethren. And they are a pietist movement of the Anabaptists. And very productive in writing songs. So what I will do right now is I will sing an old German hymn. We all know it. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. And its text was written by Jochem Neander back in the later 1600s. It was translated by Catherine Winkworth. The tune that is used comes from the Stralsund Gesangbuch, which is also a very, very old German hymnal. So yes, the Anabaptists and the Mennonites in particular did use a lot of the German material. Then I will sing for you a contemporary Anabaptist song called Move in Our Midst, written by Kenneth J. Morse. So first, praise to the Lord. Now, one of the things that I came to realize when looking into the older styles of worship is that they were slower. Okay, it seems to be a modern thing to want to really hype things up and speed them, but certainly, the older way of doing it would have been a lot slower. As we can see, that is really different from what we're used to. It's statelier, it's slower. And of course, the Amen, which a lot of us have dropped in today's churches, which I think is nice to add now and then. Move in Our Midst was composed by Kenneth L. Morse, apparently for some of their get-togethers with this Church of the Brethren. And it's really quite an interesting contemporary Anabaptist song. Move in our midst, O Spirit of God. Go with us down from your holy hill. transform our darkness into your light. Spirit of God, still lead us today. Strike from our feet the fetters that bind. Lift from our lives the weight of our wrong. Teach us to love with heart, soul, and mind. Spirit of God, still loves us, make strong. Kindle our hearts to burn with your flame. Raise up your banners high in this hour. Stir us to build new worlds in your name. Spirit of God, oh, send us your power. So now we're going to close off our program. We're going to talk about the Baptists. Now, other than the fact that they both believe the same thing, the Anabaptists and the Baptists, they have different origins. The Baptist movement also believes in a full immersion of adults who confess their sin and make the conscious confession that they are now deciding to follow Jesus and turn away from the world. However, the Baptist movement, as we know it, started in England, came out, of course, out of the Church of England, saw a lot of problems happening within that state church and the idea of church and state having absolute monopolizing control. So this was another group that decided to leave. They went through persecution, of course, as you can expect. They too had some ties with Leiden in the Netherlands. It is actually believed that some of the early Baptist movements also took place in the Netherlands, and somehow the British and the Dutch Baptists were joined together. The Baptists are known as the Dunkers, obviously because they believe in full immersion of adults. They came to America, they set up here in Canada and North America. Today it's one of the largest churches here in Canada and North America, very influential. Sometimes progressive. They're not at all as conservative as other churches. They're way more open to female ministries and all the things that the old churches in the older world just really, really would shudder at. I'm going to present two songs for you. One's an older one and one's a more modern one, written by Baptists. The first one is by Robert Lowry, who was born in Philadelphia. And he's the composer of that famous My Life Flows On in Endless Song, also known as How Can I Keep From Singing? Really beautiful song. The second one is by James Buchanan Coates, more contemporary. Early 1900s, he passed away in 1961, and he wrote a lovely, what we would call a gospel tune called Where Could I Go? And he was part of the movement moving into the evangelical gospel style. So first we will do How Can I Keep From Singing?
from singing. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging. Since Christ is Lord of heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? What though my joys and comforts die? I know my Savior liveth. What through the darkness gather round, songs in the night He giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging. Since Christ is Lord of heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? The peace of Christ makes fresh my heart, a fountain ever springing. All things are mine since I am His. How can I keep from singing? No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging. Since Christ is Lord of heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing?
Now for the Baptist Gospel hymn, Where Could I Go?
Living below in this old sinful world, hardly a comfort can afford. Striving alone to face temptation sore, where could I go but to the Lord? Where could I go? Oh, where could I go? Seeking a refuge for my soul, needing a friend to help me in the end. Where could I go but to the Lord? Neighbors are kind, I love them everyone. We get along in sweet accord.
something quite different from all the other things that we've been looking at. So that's the end of our program, and I do apologize if you're hearing banging, but we have some work being done on our roof right now. So it's a good thing that the program is wrapping up right now. Next week, we will go further looking into the Southern Baptists, which is the perfect example of the song I just sang for you. That'll be going into the Gospels, and then we will start looking into the African American repertoire from the slaves and the spiritual movement. So thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a blessed